In this video, we're going to learn about form submission in Blazor SSR. In the previous video, we learned to use edit form and special input components to collect user data. In this video, we're going to learn how to submit data. Specifically, we're learning about form submission in Blazor SSR because once we add interactivities, the process is going to be different. Blazor SSR is very similar to traditional web applications where form submission is just through regular form submission. Let's take a look at the diagram here that represents form submission in traditional web applications. So we have a browser and we have a form in the browser, and then we have the server. So this box is just representing the server, and when the user clicks on the submit button, the form fields and its values is going to be submitted back to the server. So the URL, the form values are going to be packed together as HTTP requests and sent to the server. When the server receives the HTTP request, it's going to process that request. And there are two parts that are important for processing the request. One is the function itself, which handles the form submission event. And the other is the parameters or the variables that receive the form field values. Once we have these two things, the developer will be able to code the logic inside the function, handle the values, and do whatever the developer needs to do. Here in Blazor SSR, we have a similar process. Right? We click on the submit button, everything is packaged together as a HTTP request, goes back to the server. Now, we also need to have these two things. So let's go into our Visual Studio and see how Blazor SSR implements those two important factors in form submission. First thing first, Blazor SSR requires every edit form to have a form name in order to distinguish one form from the other form, one event handler from the other event handler. So therefore, we're going to use a form name parameter here, right? So this is a component and this is a component parameter. We need to use the form name parameter here to specify the name of the form. We can give it any name. I'm going to call it form server because we are managing servers, and here we're editing the server. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we need to specify the event handler, right, which corresponds to the function that we talk about, because we need to have a function to be able to handle the form submission event. And for that, in our edit form, we have a onSubmit event handler here, and we can just specify something like submit. You can give it any name as a function name, right? So here I just put submit, and then scroll down to the code block here and then add a function. So this is going to be called submit. And once I have this as a function, scroll up, you can see that the red squiggly line is gone. That means the syntax is accepted. Now we have the function. Then we need to take care of the second part, which is receiving the values, right? So the values of the form fields need to be mapped to variables or parameters back at the server. Here, we already have a model attribute to supply data or bind data from the server, right? Because we have a variable defined in this server, and this variable is bound to the edit form in order to display the information inside the form. Now, it's a question of receiving the data from the form when the form is submitted back to the server. So how do we do that? In Blazor SSR, it's very simple. First thing first, we're going to change this to a property. So that's a requirement. And secondly, we need to provide a attribute here, right? It's a C# attribute, and it's called supply parameter from form. With this attribute, when the form is submitted back to the server, along with the URL in the HTTP request, the Blazor framework is able to find the component, because this specifies the corresponding URL. So it finds the component, and then because of the supply parameter from form attribute, it knows that the data in the form needs to be bound to this property, then it will be able to do that. Now, what if we have multiple forms, right? If we have multiple forms, each form needs to have a form name. And then inside the supply parameter form here, we can actually specify form name here. You can see we have form name. So we can specify the form name, and this form name will need to correspond to the form name that we provided up here. Right? So if we have multiple forms, then each form will have a different name, and then the form name inside this attribute will correspond to different names. In this case, we only have one form, so we don't actually have to specify this. So let's delete it. Now we have already handled the two aspects, right? The two factors of this form submission. We have a function that handles the form submission event, which is this submit event handler here. And we have a property that handles the data mapping, which binds the form field values back to our server property here. So we already handled those two aspects correctly. With that, we need to just add a submit button because we coded our form here. We did not specify our submit button. So let's do that. Let's add a line break inside the form. And then we can code a button here. So we're going to use bootstrap button, and it is going to be a primary button. And the type is very important. It has to be a submit button. It cannot be a regular button. And here, because we are editing servers, we can say update. And we can also move this inside here, and we can add a space in between, and we can remove this line break here. All right, let's give it a try. Let's set up breakpoint here and click on the debug button here. And let's go to manage servers, maybe go to number 3 here, and let's change online status to online and click on update. Our breakpoint is hit. So that means the event handler is actually handling the submission event. So now the question is, did our server object actually receive the form field values? So let's take a look. So quick watch is online is false. So we did not actually receive the form field value here. Actually, that's not true. What is actually happening here is the on parameter set is triggered again. So therefore, this server is overridden by the data from the static repository. In order to avoid having this issue, we have to make sure that we do not populate the server again if the server object already has some value. So in order to do that, we can use this double question mark. What this means is that we're only going to use the static repository to retrieve the server data if the server is null. If the server is not null, the right-hand side operation will be skipped. So let's try to do that again. Let's run the debug, go to manage servers. Let's try to edit server 1 and click on online and click on submit. Now the breakpoint is triggered. Let's watch what we have in the server variable here. And this time you can see is online becomes true. That means we are actually receiving the form fields. So those two important aspects of form submission, we have done that, right? We have our function that is triggered, and we have our server property that contains values from the form, right? So this is triggered, and our server variable here actually contains the value comes from the form. So let's continue this, and let's close and come back to maybe server number 4. Let's say I'm going to change this to 46 and change this to Toronto 1 and online. Click on update. Now let's examine the server variable here. We have server 46, Toronto 1 is online is true. So clearly we have received the value from the form submission. We just need to code our logic inside the submission now. There is just one problem here. Let's watch this again, right? Quick watch. You can see the server ID is 0. Okay? So whatever logic that you're going to put under the submit event handler here is not going to work because we don't know which server we are going to update because server ID is 0. So therefore, in the form, we need to add something. So let's stop this, and we need to add a hidden field here in order to submit the server ID back to the server when the submit button is clicked on. So let's add it at the top or at the bottom, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to say input number because ID is a number. And we're going to bind this to, again, to server dot, but this time to server ID. And this is going to be a hidden field. So I'm going to put hidden here, and that's it. Right. So with this change, let's run debug again. Now go to manage servers, maybe add it number 4. So again, I'm going to change to 46. This is to Toronto 1. Click on this and click on update. Now let's examine the server variable here, and we see that everything's changed. We also received server ID, which is number 4. Everything looks correct. Now we just need to code the logic inside the submit event handler here in order to update the server. And that is very simple. First of all, we're going to check whether the server is null or not. If it's not null, we're going to perform the update. And we're going to use the server's repository. And I'm going to say update server. I'm going to provide the server ID, which is server.server ID. And then we're going to provide the server object here. And that is it. So let's run our application again. Go to manage servers. This time let's add it number 2. And let's change number 2 to offline. Maybe we're going to change this to server dash number 2 and click on update. Looks like nothing is happening, but because we didn't add any navigation or any stuff. But if we click on the close button and coming back to the manage server screen here, you can see that the server name is already updated and the status is changed to offline. Right, so if click on edit again, change this to number 2, right, and change this back to online, click on update, click on close. Coming over here, you can see the name is changed, status changed back to online. In this video, we covered how to do form submission. And remember, there are 2 different aspects of form submission, which is the function that handles the submission event and the model binding part, which binds the form fields to the server-side variables. In Blazor SSR, those 2 aspects are handled by a submission handler, which can be the onSubmit handler, and there are different onSubmit handlers we're going to talk about later. So you can see that we have invalid submit, valid submit. In this case, we're just using onSubmit, which is fine. So that takes care of the first aspect. And then the second aspect is to receive the data, or traditionally it's called model binding. And to do that, we use the supply parameter from form attribute on top of the variable. And remember that this is the same variable that is used to bound the data to the form, which is here, right? And then we just need to specify this to receive the data from the form, right? So this is like a 2-way data binding from the attribute to the form, and then come back with the help of this attribute. And then inside the event handler, we can implement the logic that we need to implement. And that's everything I want to cover in this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.